My full name is Gert Friedrich Franz Schmitz. I'll never forget September 1st, 1939. That's when Hitler came on the radio and told everyone the war had started. He said German soldiers had marched into Poland early that morning. 6 months later, Hitler's army went into France. Then the British joined the fight and the Americans too. I remember talking to my grandpa about it. He looked worried and said, "I don't think we can win this war." I got upset and told him, "Don't say that, Grandpa. We can't lose." Back then, I truly believed we couldn't lose. It seemed impossible to me. That's because the government had brainwashed us. Hitler controlled all the newspapers and radio stations. His propaganda minister, Goebbels, controlled everything else people saw and heard. We'd listen to the news, and they'd tell us how well our army was doing on the Western Front and how they were winning battle after battle. But then we'd walk outside and hear the sound of guns firing, and I'd think, wait a minute, those guns sound way too close. They're much closer than what the news is telling us. I'm an old man now. I've lived a long life, longer than many of my comrades who didn't make it through the war. I've had decades to think about what happened, to try to make sense of it all, to reconcile the boy I was with the man I became. And I've come to believe that the most dangerous thing about what happened in Germany wasn't that evil men took power, though they did. It was that ordinary people like me, good people, people who loved their families and their country, could be shaped into serving evil without even realizing it. That's what I want to talk to you about today. Not to defend what Germany did. There is no defense for the horrors we committed. But to help you understand how it happened from the inside, from the perspective of someone who lived it, who believed it, and who has spent the rest of his life trying to atone for it. This is going to be a long conversation. I'm going to take you through my entire journey from my childhood in Nazi Germany, through my time in the Hitler Youth, my training as a pilot, my combat experience on the Western Front, my capture by American forces, and everything that came after. I'm not going to sugarcoat anything or make excuses. I'm going to tell you the truth as I experienced it, as uncomfortable as that truth might be. I'm going to tell you about the propaganda that shaped my young mind so completely that I couldn't even imagine questioning it. I'm going to tell you about the chaos and terror of combat, about watching my comrades die, about the fear that never left you even for a moment. I'm going to tell you about the moment when I finally learned the truth about what my country had done, about the concentration camps, the systematic murder, the evil that had been committed in the name of the Germany I thought I was defending. And I'm going to tell you why, after everything I experienced and everything I learned. I spent the rest of my life advocating for one simple principle, that we must talk to each other instead of killing each other. That war is the stupidest, most wasteful thing human beings do. That there has to be a better way. I know some of you are thinking, how can I listen to this man? How can I give him a platform? He fought for Nazi Germany. He was part of the machine that killed millions, and you're not wrong to think that. But here's what I've learned in my many years. If we only listen to the voices we agree with, if we only hear from people who were on the right side of history, we miss something crucial. We miss understanding how ordinary people can be turned into instruments of evil. We miss the warning signs that could help us prevent it from happening again. Because it can happen again. It is happening again, in different forms, in different places. When I see young people today being fed propaganda through their screens, when I see leaders dividing people into us and them, when I see violence being offered as the solution to complex problems, I recognize it. I've seen it before. I lived through it. So I'm asking you to stay with me. Listen to my story, Not because I deserve your sympathy or your forgiveness, I don't presume to ask for either, but because the lessons I learned might help you, might help your children, might help society avoid making the same terrible mistakes we made. This is going to be uncomfortable. There will be moments where you'll want to stop listening, where you'll feel angry or disgusted. That's okay. Feel those feelings. But don't stop listening, because understanding how something like Nazi Germany could happen, how millions of ordinary people could support or participate in such evil, that understanding is our best defense against it happening again. I'm 90-some years old now. I don't have much time left. But before I go, I want to make sure my story is told. Not for my sake, but for yours, for your children's sake, for the sake of everyone who comes after us. So let me take you back to where it all began. Let me tell you about a young boy sitting by a radio on September 1st, 1939, listening to Adolf Hitler declare war on Poland and believing with all his heart that Germany would win. Let me tell you how wrong I was and how long it took me to understand just how wrong I was. Let me tell you my story. I remember that day so clearly, even now, more than 80 years later. September 1st, 1939, I was just a boy sitting with my family gathered around our radio. It was a warm, early autumn day, but inside our home, everyone was tense, waiting. Then his voice came through the speaker. Hitler, the Führer. He was announcing that Germany had invaded Poland, that we were now at war. I want you to understand something about that moment. When I heard those words, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't worried. I was excited. I was absolutely certain that Germany would win, not just hopeful, certain. As certain as I was that the sun would rise the next morning, how could a child be so sure about something so momentous? How could I hear that my country was going to war and feel confidence instead of fear? The answer is simple, and it's the most important thing I need you to understand about everything that came after. I had been taught to believe it. Every single day of my young life, I had been fed a steady diet of propaganda that told me Germany was superior, that our cause was just, that our victory was inevitable. You have to understand what it was like living in Nazi Germany. There was no free press. There were no alternative viewpoints. Every newspaper you read, every radio broadcast you heard, every film you watched, every poster you saw on the street, all of it was controlled by Joseph Goebbels and his Ministry of Propaganda. And it wasn't crude or obvious. It was sophisticated. It was everywhere. It was woven into the fabric of daily life so completely that you didn't even notice it was there. It was just reality, the way things were. The truth about the world. We were told that Germans were a superior people, that we had been wronged by the Treaty of Versailles after the First World War, that the other nations of Europe had conspired to keep Germany down, and that Hitler was leading us back to our rightful place as a great nation. And as a child, I had no reason to doubt any of it. Why would I? Everyone around me believed it. My parents, my teachers, my friends' families. The newspapers confirmed it. The radio confirmed it. The newsreels at the cinema confirmed it. There were no dissenting voices, or if there were, they were quickly silenced, and we never heard from them. This is what totalitarianism does. It doesn't just control your actions, it controls your reality. It tells you what to think, and then it makes sure you never encounter any information that might make you question those thoughts. And if propaganda was everywhere for adults, it was even more targeted and intense for children like me. When I turned 10 years old, I received a letter. It wasn't an invitation to join a club. It wasn't asking if I wanted to participate. It was a draft notice. I was being conscripted into the Hitler Youth. Now, let me be clear about what the Hitler Youth was. It wasn't like Boy Scouts or some voluntary youth group. It was mandatory. By law, every German child had to be a member, and it wasn't about camping trips and learning to tie knots. The Hitler Youth was designed to do one thing: turn German children into loyal servants of the Nazi state, to prepare us to be soldiers, to indoctrinate us so thoroughly that questioning the regime would become psychologically impossible. From the age of 10, my life changed. We had physical training, running, marching, obstacle courses. We had military drills. We learned to follow orders without question. We were taught that obedience to authority was the highest virtue, that individual thinking was dangerous, that the collective, the Volk, the German people, was more important than any individual. And we were taught the ideology. Oh, how we were taught the ideology. We learned about racial superiority, about the supposed inferiority of other peoples, about the grand destiny that awaited Germany if we all did our duty. I absorbed all of it, every word, every lesson. It became part of how I saw the world, part of my identity. I was a German. I was part of something greater than myself. I had a role to play in Germany's glorious future. Can you imagine what that does to a child? To have your most formative years, the years when you're developing your understanding of right and wrong, your sense of morality, your worldview, to have all of that shaped by a totalitarian ideology? I didn't choose what I believed. I was taught what to believe before I had the tools to think critically about it. And by the time I was old enough to potentially question things, those beliefs were so deeply embedded that questioning them felt impossible. It would have been like questioning whether the sky was blue or whether water was wet. This is what frightens me most when I look at the world today. I see young people being fed propaganda through their phones and computers. I see them being told what to think, being divided into groups, being taught to see other people as enemies. And I recognize the pattern. I've lived through it. The methods are different now. No one's running mandatory youth camps like the Hitler Youth. But the principle is the same. Get to people when they're young, shape their thinking before they develop critical faculties, create an echo chamber where they only hear one perspective, and you can make them believe almost anything. I believed everything. I believed Germany was right. I believed our enemies were wrong. I believed we would win. I believed I was part of something noble and necessary. I was wrong about all of it, but I didn't know that yet. As a young teenager growing up in Nazi Germany, I was certain, absolutely certain, that I was on the right side of history. And that certainty would carry me through the next several years, through training, through combat, through horrors I couldn't have imagined as that boy sitting by the radio in 1939. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you what happened next after those years in the Hitler Youth, when I was selected for something that seemed like the opportunity of a lifetime. As I moved through my teenage years, the war continued, and despite what the propaganda told us about constant German victories, even I could sense that things were getting harder. There were more rationing, more restrictions. The bombing raids on our cities became more frequent and more devastating. But I was still a believer, still certain of ultimate German victory. And then something happened that seemed to confirm everything I'd been taught about German superiority. I was selected for an elite training program. I was going to become a jet pilot. Let me tell you what this meant. The Messerschmitt Me 262 was the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world at that time. A jet. Not a propeller plane like the Allies were flying. An actual jet-powered fighter that could reach speeds no Allied aircraft could match. This was German engineering at its finest. This was proof, we were told, that German technology was superior, that we had weapons the Allies couldn't compete with, that victory was still possible even as the war turned against us. Being selected for this program felt incredible. Out of all the young men in Germany, I had been chosen to fly the most advanced aircraft ever built. It was validation. It was purpose. It was everything I'd been trained for in the Hitler Youth coming to fruition. I was sent to begin my training. We learned about the aircraft, its capabilities, its systems. The Me-262 was extraordinary. It could fly at over 540 miles per hour. The fastest Allied fighters could barely reach 400 miles per hour. In theory, an Me-262 pilot could engage enemy aircraft at will, attack, and escape before they could even react. It was going to change the war, we were told. These jets would sweep the Allied bombers from our skies. They would give Germany air superiority again. They would turn the tide. I believed it. Why wouldn't I? I was seeing this incredible technology with my own eyes. I was going to be one of the pilots flying it. But then reality intervened. And this is where the gap between Nazi propaganda and actual reality became impossible to ignore, even for someone as indoctrinated as I was. Before I could complete my training, before I ever got to sit in the cockpit of a Me-262, the Allied bombers came. They attacked our air base. And when I say attacked, I mean they destroyed it. Completely. The runways were cratered. The buildings were rubble. The aircraft, those incredible advanced jets that were supposed to win us the war, were destroyed or had to be evacuated to bases elsewhere. And my training? Over, just like that. See, this is what the propaganda never told us. Yes, Germany had developed incredible technology. The Me-262 was real, and it was superior to anything the Allies had. But technology alone doesn't win wars. The Allies didn't need to build better planes than the Me-262. They just needed to destroy the bases where they operated, the factories where they were built, the fuel supplies that powered them, the trained pilots who flew them. And they could do that because they had overwhelming numbers, unlimited resources, and total air superiority over Germany by this point in the war. We could build the most advanced fighter jet in the world, but we couldn't protect the infrastructure needed to make it matter. We were like a man with a sophisticated rifle but no bullets, or a master swordsman surrounded by 100 enemies with clubs. The destruction of my training base should have been a wake-up call. It should have made me question what I'd been told about inevitable German victory. But the human mind is a strange thing. When your entire worldview is built on certain beliefs, you don't abandon those beliefs just because of contradictory evidence. You explain it away. You make excuses. I told myself it was just bad luck, just one setback, that Germany still had other bases, other aircraft, other plans, that we would still win somehow. But my personal plans had changed dramatically. Instead of becoming an elite jet pilot, soaring above the battlefield with the most advanced technology in the world, I received new orders. I was being sent to the Western Front as a ground soldier. Imagine that transition. One moment you're training to be part of Germany's technological elite, flying cutting-edge aircraft. The next moment, you're being handed a rifle and sent to the place where the German army was being systematically destroyed by the Allied advance. I was terrified. I didn't want to admit it. We'd been taught that German soldiers were brave, that fear was weakness, that we should welcome the opportunity to fight for the fatherland. But I was terrified, because even through the propaganda, even through the censored news reports, we'd heard things about the Western Front. We'd heard about the massive Allied armies pushing into Germany. We'd heard about the overwhelming firepower they possessed. We'd heard about German units being encircled and destroyed. But I was a soldier. I had my orders, and everything I'd been taught since I was 10 years old told me that my duty was to obey, without question, to fight for Germany no matter what. So I went. I left behind my dreams of flying jets and headed west, toward the sound of the guns, toward chaos I couldn't possibly have prepared for. And what I found there would change everything. Nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what I encountered when I arrived at the Western Front. All of my training in the Hitler Youth, all of the propaganda about German military superiority, all of the newsreels showing disciplined German soldiers marching in perfect formation, none of it bore any resemblance to what I saw. It was chaos, pure, absolute chaos. Let me try to describe it to you. Imagine arriving at a battlefield where no one knows what's happening, where units have been scattered by Allied attacks and no one knows where anyone else is, where communication lines have been destroyed so there are no clear orders coming down, where the chain of command has broken down because officers are dead, missing, or just as confused as everyone else. That's what I walked into. I remember arriving at what was supposed to be my unit's position and finding, I don't even know what to call it. A collection of soldiers, yes, but not a proper military unit. Some were from my regiment. Some were from other units that had been destroyed and scattered. Some were older men who should never have been sent to fight. Some were boys even younger than me. No one seemed to know where we were supposed to be or what we were supposed to do. We didn't know where the enemy was. We didn't know where other German forces were. We didn't have clear objectives. We didn't have a strategy. We were just there, waiting for something to happen, waiting for orders that might never come, trying to figure out how to survive the next hour, the next day. This wasn't the war they'd told us about. This wasn't disciplined German soldiers executing brilliant strategies against inferior opponents. This was an army falling apart, disintegrating under the weight of Allied numerical and material superiority. And then there was the constant fear. I want you to understand what it's like to be a soldier in a combat zone when you have no idea what's happening. Every sound could be enemy soldiers approaching. Every shadow could be a tank. Every moment you're waiting for bullets to start flying, for explosions to tear through your position, for death to arrive without warning. We couldn't sleep properly. We couldn't eat properly. The stress was constant, grinding, exhausting in a way that physical labor never is. And then the actual combat started. I'll never forget the first time I encountered Allied fighter planes. We were moving along a road. I don't even remember why we were moving or where we were going. Someone shouted, and I looked up. There they were, P-51 Mustangs. American fighter planes diving toward us, their machine guns already firing. I threw myself to the ground. Bullets tore up the road around me. I could hear men screaming. I pressed myself into the dirt, trying to make myself as small as possible, praying that the next burst of fire wouldn't find me. It felt like it lasted forever, but it was probably only a few seconds. The planes roared overhead and were gone, leaving behind dead and wounded men on the road. I survived. Some of my comrades didn't, and all we could do was pick ourselves up and keep moving because staying in one place made us targets for the next attack. I came to hate those P-51 Mustangs with a passion. To this day, even as an old man, I can't see pictures of them without feeling a surge of not quite anger, but something. Remembered fear, remembered helplessness, because that's what it was. Helplessness. We were foot soldiers with rifles. What could we do against aircraft? Nothing. We could only hide and hope the pilots didn't see us or that their bullets missed us. Our lives depended entirely on luck. And then there were the tanks. I remember one encounter particularly clearly. We were in a small town, or what was left of a small town after the fighting, when American tanks rolled in. Now, we'd been told about German tanks, the Tigers, the Panthers, superior armor and guns that could destroy any Allied tank. And maybe that was true somewhere, with proper tank units that had fuel and ammunition and support. But we weren't a tank unit. We were infantry. And all the propaganda in the world doesn't help an infantryman facing an armored vehicle. We tried to fight. We fired our rifles, which was useless. Some men had Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, and they tried to get close enough to use them. A few managed it. I don't know if they did any real damage. What I remember is the noise, the enormous, overwhelming noise of tank cannons firing, of machine guns chattering, of explosions. And I remember running, trying to find cover, trying to get away from those massive metal monsters that we had no way to fight effectively. More men died, more men were wounded, and those of us who survived scattered, trying to regroup, trying to figure out what to do next. This was my introduction to combat. Not glory, not heroism, just fear, confusion, death, and the desperate struggle to survive from one moment to the next. And through it all, I still believed. Can you imagine that? Even as the German army fell apart around me, even as I watched men die for no clear purpose, even as it became obvious that we were losing, I still believed that somehow Germany would prevail. That's the power of the indoctrination I'd received. Even reality crashing down around me couldn't immediately break through the walls that had been built in my mind since childhood. But those walls were starting to crack, and what would finally break through them was something I couldn't have anticipated. My war was about to end, though not in the way I'd expected. I don't remember exactly when I was captured. The end of my time as a combatant blends together in my memory. There was so much chaos, so much fear, so many moments where I thought I was going to die. What I do remember is the sense of relief. I know that might sound strange. I was being captured by the enemy after all. But in that moment when American soldiers took me prisoner, what I felt most strongly was that it was over. The fear, the chaos, the constant threat of death. It was finally over for me. I wasn't going to be shot at anymore. I wasn't going to have to run from tanks or dive for cover from fighter planes. I wasn't going to watch more of my comrades die. I was captured, and in a strange way, I was saved. The American soldiers who took me prisoner weren't cruel. They searched me for weapons. They took my gear, but they didn't beat me or abuse me. I'd heard stories, propaganda stories, about how the Americans would torture prisoners. It wasn't true, at least not in my experience. They processed me along with other captured German soldiers. There were so many of us by that point. The German army was collapsing, and soldiers were surrendering by the thousands. Some fought to the end, yes. Some died defending positions that didn't matter. But many of us, when given the chance, chose to survive rather than die for a cause that was clearly lost. I was transported to a POW camp. And this is where something profound started to happen in my mind, though I didn't fully realize it at the time. For the first time in my life, I was removed from the constant reinforcement of Nazi propaganda. There were no radio broadcasts telling us about German victories. There were no newspapers proclaiming our inevitable triumph. There were no officers reminding us of our duty to the Führer. There was just time. Time to think. Time to talk with other prisoners. Time to process what had happened. I started drawing. I'd always liked to draw. And in the camp, I had time to sketch the faces of other prisoners, the scenes around me, the guards. It helped me process things, helped me make sense of the chaos I'd lived through. And I started hearing things. From the American guards, from other prisoners who'd been captured earlier and had heard more. Things about the war, things about what had really been happening in Germany. At first I didn't believe it. How could I? Everything I'd been taught told me that the Americans were liars, that enemy propaganda was designed to demoralize us, that I shouldn't trust anything they said. But then I started hearing about the camps, not POW camps like the one I was in, other camps, places with names that meant nothing to me then, but would become synonymous with horror. Auschwitz, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, concentration camps. I remember the first time someone tried to explain to me what had happened in these places. I didn't understand, or maybe I didn't want to understand. They were telling me that Germany, my Germany, the country I'd fought for, had been systematically murdering people. Not soldiers in combat, but civilians, women, children, elderly people, murdering them by the millions because of their religion or ethnicity or political beliefs. I told them they were wrong. It had to be Allied propaganda, lies designed to make us feel guilty, to justify what they'd done to Germany. But more and more prisoners were hearing the same stories, and then some of the Americans showed us photographs from the liberated camps, bodies stacked like cordwood, living skeletons in striped uniforms, gas chambers, crematoria. I didn't want to believe it. Every fiber of my being resisted believing it. This couldn't be true. This couldn't be what Germany had been doing while I was fighting what I thought was a defensive war. But the evidence kept mounting. More photographs, more testimonies, and finally, the bitter truth that some of the prisoners, including a few I'd fought alongside, had actually known something about this. They'd heard rumors, they'd seen things, and they'd looked away, or convinced themselves it wasn't really happening, or told themselves that there must be a good reason. This was when everything I'd believed started to crumble. I'd fought for Germany believing we were in the right, believing we were defending ourselves against unjust enemies, believing that our cause was noble. And now I was learning that while I was dodging bullets on the Western Front, while I was watching my comrades die, while I was fighting what I thought was a righteous war, my country, my government, the regime I'd sworn loyalty to had been committing genocide. 6 million Jews, millions of others, murdered systematically, industrially, in a planned program of extermination. I can't describe to you what that does to a person. To realize that you've been part of something monstrous, to understand that your service, your sacrifice, your willingness to die, it was all in service to evil. I didn't know. I genuinely didn't know. The Nazi regime had been very effective at hiding the Holocaust from the general population and from most of the military. Those who did know were sworn to secrecy on pain of death. The rest of us were kept ignorant. But ignorance isn't innocence. I was still part of the system. I still fought for that regime. I still helped, in my small way, to keep Nazi Germany functioning for as long as I did. And I've had to live with that knowledge for the rest of my life. Some German soldiers, when confronted with the truth about the Holocaust, refused to believe it. They insisted it was propaganda, even when shown undeniable proof. They couldn't psychologically accept that they'd been so wrong about what they'd fought for. I understood that impulse. Part of me wanted to do the same thing, but I couldn't. The evidence was too overwhelming. The truth was too clear. Germany had committed atrocities that would forever mark it as one of the darkest chapters in human history. And I had been part of that Germany, even if I didn't know what was being done in its name. This realization was crushing. Everything I'd believed since I was 10 years old was a lie. Everything I'd been taught was wrong. The cause I'd been willing to die for was evil. Who was I now? What did my life mean? What did any of it mean? These were the questions I grappled with in that POW camp, and for many years afterward. And eventually, slowly, I came to a conclusion. I couldn't change what I'd done. I couldn't undo my participation in Nazi Germany's war. But I could choose what I did with the rest of my life. I could choose to learn from what had happened. I could choose to never let myself be manipulated by propaganda again. I could choose to speak out against the kind of thinking that led to the Holocaust. And I could choose to dedicate myself to the principle that there had to be a better way for humanity to resolve its conflicts than the way we'd tried and failed so catastrophically during World War II. But first, I had to survive the aftermath of the war and figure out what to do with my life. After the war ended, I was eventually released from the POW camp. I returned to Germany, but the Germany I came back to was nothing like the one I'd left. Our cities were in ruins. Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin, reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. Millions of Germans were dead. Millions more were displaced refugees. The economy was shattered. People were starving. And hanging over everything was the knowledge of what we'd done. The concentration camps had been liberated, and the world now knew the full extent of Nazi Germany's crimes. We Germans had to live with that shame, that collective guilt. I was young still, and I had to decide what to do with my life. I could have stayed in Germany, helped with the rebuilding, tried to make a new life there. Many did. They worked hard to rebuild their country, to create a new Germany that would never allow something like Nazism to rise again. But I made a different choice. I immigrated to the United States. Think about that for a moment. I moved to the country whose soldiers I'd fought against, the country whose planes had strafed my positions, the country that had defeated everything I'd once believed in. Why? Because America represented something that post-war Germany couldn't immediately offer me, a chance to start fresh, a place where my past wouldn't define my future, an opportunity to build a life based on who I chose to become, not who I'd been forced to be. I pursued education, I worked hard, and eventually I found my way into aerospace engineering, the field that had fascinated me ever since I'd been selected for that jet pilot training that never happened. It's ironic, isn't it? I'd wanted to fly the most advanced aircraft Germany could build. Instead, I ended up helping to develop aerospace technology in America. I even worked in the same field as Wernher von Braun, the German rocket scientist who designed the V-2 rockets during the war and then came to America to help develop the space program. Von Braun is a complicated figure. His rockets killed people during the war. They were terror weapons launched at London, and they were built by slave labor from concentration camps. But he was also crucial to putting Americans on the moon. How do you reconcile those two things? I don't know if you can. Some things in life don't have neat, tidy answers. What I do know is that I tried to use my skills for something constructive, something positive. I tried to build rather than destroy. And remarkably, incredibly, I even served in the United States Army. Yes, I wore an American uniform. I took an oath to defend the United States. Me, a former German soldier who had fought against American forces. America gave me that chance. They didn't define me by my worst moments. They gave me the opportunity to prove who I could become. Not every country would do that. Not every society is willing to accept former enemies and give them a chance at redemption. I built a career. I built a life. I became an American citizen. I raised a family. I worked on projects that I was proud of, but I never forgot where I came from or what I'd experienced. And as I grew older, as I had the perspective of decades to look back on what had happened, I came to a conclusion that I've spent my later years trying to share with anyone who will listen. War is the stupidest thing we do. I don't say that lightly. I'm not some naive pacifist who's never experienced conflict. I was a soldier. I fought. I nearly died multiple times. I know what war is. I've lived it. And my conclusion, drawn from that lived experience, is that war is wasteful, destructive, and ultimately futile as a way to solve problems. Think about World War II. Tens of millions of people died. Entire cities were destroyed. Economies were ruined. Families were torn apart. Atrocities were committed that scarred humanity forever. And what did it actually solve? Yes, Nazi Germany was defeated, and that was necessary. The evil of that regime had to be stopped. But the underlying issues that led to the war, nationalism, economic competition, ethnic tensions, political disagreements, those didn't go away. They just got frozen in place by the exhaustion of war and the threat of nuclear weapons. Many of those same tensions still exist today in different forms. War doesn't solve problems. It just creates new ones while destroying the lives of the people caught up in it. I've spent the later part of my life advocating for a simple principle. We need to talk to each other instead of killing each other. We need to use dialogue, negotiation, compromise, and understanding to resolve our conflicts. I know that sounds simple, maybe even simplistic, but it's the truth I've learned through bitter experience. When you've watched friends die in pointless battles, when you've lived through the collapse of everything you believed in, when you've had to confront the evil that your own side committed, you understand that there has to be a better way. Violence is easy. War is easy, in the sense that it doesn't require you to do the hard work of understanding your enemies, of finding common ground, of compromising. You just fight until one side wins or everyone's too exhausted to continue. But peace, real, lasting peace, that's hard. That requires patience, empathy, willingness to listen to perspectives you disagree with, ability to find solutions that work for everyone rather than just declaring winners and losers. And yes, sometimes force is necessary to stop genuinely evil actors. I'm not saying there's never a place for military action. Nazi Germany had to be stopped, and words alone wouldn't have done it. But we resort to war far too quickly. We use violence when we should use dialogue. We choose destruction when we should choose construction. I see it happening today. I see conflicts around the world where people are killing each other over differences that could be resolved through negotiation. I see leaders using military force instead of doing the hard diplomatic work to find peaceful solutions. I see propaganda, different from Nazi propaganda, but still propaganda, being used to dehumanize enemies and make violence seem acceptable. And it terrifies me because I've seen where that leads. I'm an old man now. I don't have many years left. But before I go, I want to leave you with this message. Learn from my mistakes. Learn from Germany's mistakes. Learn from the catastrophe of World War II. Don't let yourself be manipulated by propaganda. Think critically about what you're being told, especially by those in power. Seek out diverse perspectives. Question narratives that divide people into good guys and bad guys. Don't support violence as a first resort. Push for dialogue, for negotiation, for peaceful resolution of conflicts. Make your leaders work harder to find nonviolent solutions before resorting to war. And most importantly, see the humanity in people who are different from you. That's what propaganda tries to take away, the ability to see your enemies as human beings. Once you stop seeing people as human, anything becomes possible, including genocide. I was taught not to see certain people as fully human. That teaching, that propaganda, that dehumanization, That's what made the Holocaust possible. And it can happen again if we're not vigilant. So talk to each other, listen to each other. Try to understand each other even when it's difficult. Because the alternative of war, violence, and hatred, that alternative is far worse than any of us can imagine until we've lived through it. I lived through it, and I'm telling you, there has to be a better way. We have to choose to be better. I know it wasn't easy to hear. It certainly wasn't easy for me to live through. And after all these years, it still isn't easy for me to tell. But I believe with every fiber of my being that these stories need to be told. Not to make excuses for what happened, not to seek sympathy or forgiveness that I have no right to ask for, but to help future generations understand something crucial about human nature and history, to understand how ordinary people can be swept up in extraordinary evil and how we might prevent it from happening again. You see, I'm one of the last. When I look around, most of my comrades are gone now. Most of the people who lived through World War II on all sides of the conflict have passed away. The Allied soldiers who fought against us, the civilians who survived the bombing raids, the survivors of the concentration camps, every day, more of them leave us. Soon, very soon, there will be no living memory of that war left at all. Just recorded testimonies like this one, just words and images preserved in archives and museums. And that frightens me, not because I think my story specifically is so important, but because when the last of us are gone, when there's no one left who actually lived through it, the war will become just another chapter in history books. It will become abstract, distant, something that happened a long time ago to people who aren't around anymore. And when that happens, it becomes easier to forget the lessons, easier to dismiss the warnings, easier to think that could never happen again, or we're different now, or we've evolved past that. But we haven't. Human nature hasn't changed. The mechanisms of propaganda, the appeal of authoritarian leaders, the tendency to divide the world into us versus them, the willingness to dehumanize those we see as enemies, all of that is still with us. It never went away. It's just waiting for the right conditions to resurface. I see those conditions forming in various parts of the world today. I see leaders using the same rhetorical techniques that Hitler used. I see propaganda spreading through social media faster and more effectively than Goebbels could have ever dreamed. I see people retreating into echo chambers where they only hear opinions they already agree with. I see societies polarizing, dividing, turning on themselves, and I recognize all of it because I've seen it before. I lived through it. I was shaped by it. That's why I'm telling you this story now, while I still can. That's why I'm asking you to listen, even though parts of it are uncomfortable or disturbing. Because the alternative of forgetting, of not learning from history, that's even more disturbing. So I ask you, don't let these stories be forgotten. Don't let the lessons we learned at such terrible cost be wasted. If you found value in hearing my story, then support efforts to preserve the testimonies of veterans and survivors while they're still with us. There are organizations, the Veterans History Project, the Shoah Foundation, local historical societies, that are racing against time to record these stories before the people who live them are gone. Donate to these efforts if you can. Volunteer if you're able. Share these stories with others. And perhaps most importantly, if you know someone who lived through World War II or any other major historical event, sit down with them. Ask them to tell you their story. Record it if they'll let you. Preserve it for future generations. These are not just interesting anecdotes or entertainment. These are warnings from people who've seen the worst of what humanity can do. These are lessons written in blood and suffering. These are testimonies that could help prevent future atrocities if we're willing to listen and learn from them. Listen to their stories, even when those stories are uncomfortable, especially when they're uncomfortable, because the comfortable stories don't teach us much. It's the difficult ones, the ones that challenge our assumptions and force us to confront ugly truths about human nature. Those are the ones we need most. And most of all, remember this: war is the stupidest thing we do. I cannot emphasize this enough. I've spent my entire adult life trying to process and understand what I experienced. And this is the conclusion I keep coming back to. War doesn't solve problems. It just creates new ones while destroying countless lives in the process. War doesn't bring out the best in humanity. It brings out the worst, and then forces us to live with the consequences. War doesn't make the world safer. It leaves behind trauma, hatred, and the seeds of future conflicts. I know some people think war is sometimes necessary. I know there are philosophical arguments about just wars and necessary evils. And I'm not naive. I understand that sometimes violence must be met with force, that evil must be stopped even when it requires military action. But we resort to war far too easily. We choose violence when we should choose dialogue. We reach for weapons when we should be reaching for understanding. We dehumanize our enemies when we should be recognizing our shared humanity. And I'm telling you, from the perspective of someone who's been on the losing side of history's most devastating war, someone who's had to live with the knowledge of what his country did, someone who's spent decades trying to make sense of it all, there has to be a better way. Talk to each other. I know that sounds simple, but it's profound. When you talk to someone, when you truly listen to them, it becomes much harder to kill them. It becomes much harder to see them as less than human. It becomes much harder to support policies that would harm them. The Nazis worked very hard to prevent Germans from talking to Jews, from seeing them as fellow human beings, from understanding their perspectives. Why? Because if we had talked to them, if we had listened to them, if we had seen them as real people with families and hopes and dreams, the Holocaust would have been impossible. Dehumanization is always the first step toward atrocity. Always. And the antidote to dehumanization is communication, understanding, empathy. Listen to each other. Try to understand each other, even when it's difficult, even when you disagree profoundly. You don't have to agree with someone to recognize their humanity. You don't have to accept their beliefs to acknowledge that they're a person with legitimate concerns and experiences that shaped those beliefs. Choose understanding over violence. Choose dialogue over destruction. Choose peace over war. Not because it's easy, it's not. It's much harder than violence. But because it's the only path that actually leads somewhere worth going. I've seen what the other path leads to. I've walked it. I've lived through its consequences. And I'm spending what time I have left trying to warn you. Don't go down that path. Find another way. That's my message. That's what I've learned from a lifetime of trying to understand what happened to me, to Germany, to the world during those terrible years from 1939 to 1945. I was a child who was taught to hate. I was a teenager who was prepared to die for an evil cause I didn't understand was evil. I was a young man who fought in a war that should never have been fought. And I've been an old man carrying the weight of that history, trying to make whatever small contribution I can toward ensuring it never happens again. I can't undo what I was part of. I can't bring back the people who died. I can't erase the stain on Germany's history or on my own conscience. But I can tell my story. I can share what I've learned. I can add my voice to the chorus of those who've experienced war and emerged from it saying, "Never again. There must be a better way." I hope you'll take this message to heart. I hope you'll think about it when you hear politicians talking about enemies and threats and the necessity of force. I hope you'll remember it when you see propaganda trying to make you hate people you've never met. I hope you'll act on it by choosing dialogue, by seeking understanding, by refusing to dehumanize others no matter how different they are from you. Because the future, your children's future, humanity's future, depends on us learning these lessons and choosing a different path than the one my generation took. I'm 90-some years old now. I won't be here much longer. But you will be. And the choices you make, the values you uphold, the kind of world you help create, that will determine whether the lessons of World War II were learned or forgotten. Please don't forget. Please don't let it happen again. Please choose peace. Thank you for listening to an old soldier's story. Thank you for giving me the chance to share what I've learned. And thank you for whatever you do, however small, to make the world a little more peaceful, a little more understanding, a little more human. May we all work toward a future where stories like mine never have to be told again, where no child is indoctrinated into hatred, where no young person is sent to kill or die for causes they don't fully understand, where no society descends into the kind of evil that defined Nazi Germany. That's my hope. That's my prayer. That's what I'm asking you to help build. Talk to each other, listen to each other, see the humanity in each other, and choose peace. Always choose peace. Thank you, and goodbye.